Thanks, Pamela, and thanks to everyone who helped make this event occur tonight. So, first of all, apologize for my accent. If you have any trouble understanding me, watch more American television. I want to acknowledge that I'm somewhat of a stranger in a strange land. I don't deeply understand and know your culture, so I'm going to be talking from a framework of my culture, and it'll be your job to sort of transpose what works or potentially can work in your culture, okay? I'm going to probably take up the bulk of the time we have, but I promise to leave at least a little time at the end for some Q&A, because I'm sure it'll be very rich. Okay, so let's start now with this topic, intelligent disobedience. And well, first let me ask you something. How many of you are affiliated with the business school? Okay, a cadre there. How many are alumni? Okay, how many are community activists? All right, a couple. How many are in the workforce? Okay, so we've got a good cross section here of people. So let me start by telling you what is this topic, intelligent disobedience, and I'm going to start by telling you how I learned about it. Okay, so I've written another book which is available on the table there called The Courageous Follower, and it basically is about when you're not the leader, how do you help the leader be successful, but also how do you help tactfully correct the leader if he or she is starting to go a bit off the rails. Now, in my country, our leaders don't go off the rails, but just in case, you know, they might. So I teach a lot of government managers this material, and one day I was teaching a class, and people were sitting around tables, about 6 people around a table, and I was talking about authority, how most of the time it makes sense to do what authority asks you to do, but sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it can even be dangerous. And a woman raised her hand and said, I have an example under the table. Well, that got my interest. What did she have under the table? She had a dog under the table, and she explained that she was, the dog for the first 1.5 years of its life was living with her and her family, and they were socializing it and teaching it to obey all the commands it would need to know in order to be a guide dog for a person who is blind. And then she said it has to go to a higher level trainer to teach it intelligent disobedience. I never heard the term. I said, what does that mean? And she said, well, just think about it. If the person who's blind gives a command to go forward, and there's a quiet car coming around the corner, the dog must not obey. Because if it obeys, it's going to harm the human being and itself. And if it can't learn to differentiate between when to obey and when to disobey, it cannot be a guide dog. So here's the first question for you. If we can teach dogs the difference between when to obey and when not to obey, why aren't we doing a better job with humans, right? So that began this journey for me. Now, okay, let's start with the definitions here. First of all, what is appropriate obedience? I'm going to look at this here. Compliance, when the system is reasonably just, no system is completely just. When it's reasonably just, the leader has legitimate authority and competence, and the order does not seem like it will be harmful if executed. It may not be the best order in the world, but it won't be harmful. So we generally obey. By contrast, if the order comes from someone who's not a legitimate authority or will produce avoidable harm, that's when we want to intelligently disobey. So that's the distinction between the two states, if you will. So let me tell you a story that, again, I learned from my students when I'm teaching. And a woman told me a story about when she was a young nurse, fresh out of nursing school. And she was assigned to an emergency room. and a cardiac patient was rushed in, and the physician who was on call quickly examined him and told her, administer this drug now. And she was shocked, because she had been taught that that was not the right drug to use at that time. He's the physician. She's just a nurse, a young nurse at that. So imagine, you know, kind of the dilemma. So she said to the doctor, "Doctor, I was taught that's not the right medication to use in this case." And he looked at her and he said, "You just do what I said." Because he was, you know, he was busy, he was harried, maybe he was working too long hours. And so now put yourself again in her shoes. If she obeys, and it's the wrong drug, and the patient, you know, gets harmed or killed, how would she feel? If she doesn't obey, and he was right, do you see the dilemma? Here's what she did. She hooked up the IV with the drug that he prescribed, and she called him over, and she said, "Doctor, it's all ready to go. My training says this is the right drug, so I can't turn the valve. If you're sure it's the right drug, please turn the valve." And that was enough to get him to rethink his order, prescribe a safer, more appropriate medication. So you see, it's not just obey or disobey, but sometimes we have to engage the authority figure in such a way that they will reconsider. Okay? So now, what is an authority in its simplest form? It's somebody who has the power, the right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. All societies need some degree of appropriate authority figures. Authority itself is not the problem. Here's where what we have to understand about authority. There are two ways to think about authority. One is the structure. How many of you work in a company where there are managers and maybe executives? Okay. So we know that some people have to have the right to issue orders to other people, to sign off on a new computer system or a new program, etc. So these are what we call the externally assigned roles of who has the right to issue what order to whom. In a large organization, when that's done well, it promotes efficiency. See, there's nothing wrong, in fact, it's necessary often, to have an authority structure. Where does the problem come in? The problem comes in not with the external rules, but with the internalized rules of behavior. What do I mean by that? It means that we carry around with us certain rules about how we're supposed to behave to people who have more authority than we, or if we're the authority figure, how we're entitled to behave to those below us. And that's where the devil can creep in, because now we don't necessarily have the free flow of good information and ideas between professionals. Instead, we have sort of dominance and submission. And that's where problems can start to arise. So look at this for a moment. Where do these rules, these internalized rules, come from? Okay, see if you recognize any of these, perhaps from your own upbringing. Listen, don't talk. Don't speak back. Don't correct the authority. Don't cause trouble. If you speak, be polite, don't be assertive. If your idea isn't accepted, don't keep trying to communicate. Do as you're told. The authority figure knows best. How many can recognize some of those rules when you were growing up? Your parents, school, etc. Well, hopefully, as professionals, we outgrow these. But you know what? We don't always fully outgrow these. And then what happens is we can be too obedient to authority when we ought not to be. So I'm going to show you a video here that it's humorous, but it's also frightening in a sense. This is from the stage.
You're on candid camera. No, you're not, actually. But my first guest tonight is the man who ran those tests we just showed you, where people meekly did things like lie down on the conveyor belt of what they thought was an airport X-ray machine, simply because he told them to. Let's show some more of it. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, just leaning forward, hands straight ahead of you. You don't have to climb in, I'll take care of it. Hands straight forward, head down. Here we go, are you all set? Lift your leg just a bit. Okay, put your legs down, legs down, legs down. Here we go now.
The airport screener on that tape was Peter Funt of Candid Camera, who joins us now. And you've done a lot of these tests over the years. It bothers you sometimes that people obeyed you?
It scares me, far beyond bother. I should point out, though, John, I think it's important, that airport gag was done a few months before 9/11.
Yeah, 1 month, actually.
Yeah,
Check that
and
couldn't
I
do
don't,
that now.
Well, and I don't think I'd want to. You know, airport security back then was kind of laughable, and some think it's laughable now, but for entirely different reasons, and that's a whole other story. But we were simply there not to test security at an airport, but to demonstrate once again, as we have many times on Candid Camera, the power of authority and the way people will obey without thinking.
Only one person said, no, I'm not going to go on the belt.
We photographed 12 people that day. 11 rolled through that device, which, by the way, was a fake. There were no X-rays. That was just an empty box. But they didn't know that, and they rolled back and forth. One guy said, you know, I'm going to take a bus, and he left. Good for him. That's right.
So now we have to ask this question. Why does a leader give a bad order? Now, I chose this person. She happens to be the only CEO, African-American CEO of a Fortune 500 company in the United States. She's a wonderful CEO, has a terrific reputation. You could feel her positive energy. So I'm only using her because I think we have to remember we don't want to demonize leaders just because they sometimes give a wrong order. But let's look at what's the range of reasons they can give a bad order. Well, they may not have all the data. They may think they have, in fact, they never have all the data, but they may not have critical data. They may have sufficient data, but be interpreting it incorrectly. They may have a lot of pressure on them. As we know in our public corporations, in the states at least, the pressure for quarterly results is so great, and the board gets on them if they don't make the projected targets. There's a term called normalization of deviance. We saw this in our financial services industry before the big crash in 2008, where everybody started to relax the standards of how you qualified for a mortgage or something like that. And it became so normal that people didn't even realize how much deviance was involved. There can be values conflict. There's always the value to do the right thing, and then there's the operational value. We have to get to market ahead of our competitors, those types of things. And one particularly problematic thing with a very successful political figure or a business figure is that they've been successful, and they start to feel, I can do no wrong. Look, I got here, you didn't get here, so I'm listening to myself. Donald Trump, when he's asked, who do you listen to for foreign policy advice, he says, myself. When he knows almost nothing. So the point being that orders can be given for benign reasons or for ethically problematic reasons that are not good orders. Either way, the question becomes, if we're the one receiving the order, what do we do with it? Why do we obey an order that we do not feel is the right order? So for this, in the book, I go fairly deeply into the famous experiments done by Professor Stanley Milgram in the 1960s at Yale University, where, how many of you are familiar with these experiments, by the way? I'm just curious. Only a few here. They're the experiment, so let me briefly describe it. What he did was he set up this false electric shock machine, and it had 30 switches, and they were numbered 15 volts to 450 volts. And the person who was the subject of the experiment didn't know that he was the subject. He thought that the learner was the subject. And his job, the real subject's job, was to ask a question of the learner, and every time he got it wrong, he would give him a shock, and he always had to increase it. The supposed purpose of the experiment was to see, could you accelerate learning by administering pain for wrong answers? Well, you know, very problematic hypothesis there, but you could see, well, maybe it made sense. It's research. That wasn't what the experiment was about. It was really to see how many people would keep obeying. And shockingly, I guess that's a pun there, I didn't mean to. 2/3 of the people in the basic experiment continued giving shocks up to 450 volts. Okay? Now you might be sitting there saying, that's crazy. I would never do that. Who are these stupid people that would do that? All right, here's the problem. Professor Milgram did another sort of test about this experiment. He took a bunch of people just like you, and a third of them were psychiatrists, so maybe not just like you. A third of them were students, and a third of them were just, you know, regular middle-class folks. And he told them what the experiment was about, and he said, where do you believe you would stop obeying? And you can see that nobody thought they would go to 450 volts. Almost nobody thought that they would go above 240 volts. And yet, 2/3 of the people went to 450 volts. This experiment was repeated many times, you know, with the almost the same result, and it was done in different countries as well. So this was a very frightening set of data that people in where they thought the authority figure was in control, that they would obey the authority figure. Now, here's the good news. They weren't sadistic. They were very uncomfortable because the learner would start to scream at about, you know, at about 150 volts. They would go, oh, stop, you know, I can't take this anymore. And the subject would turn to the authority figure. He had a clipboard, the authority figure, and a sort of a lab coat. And, are you sure this is okay? And he would say, yes, it's okay. There's no tissue damage being done. Yes, and so they go up to 240 volts, and the person being, I want out, I've got a heart condition. And the subject would go, are you really sure this is okay? And the authority figure would simply say, the experiment requires that you continue, please continue. In other words, the authority figure didn't have a gun at their head. He didn't control their paycheck. All he had was the symbols of authority. And 2/3 people obeyed. Now, what do we need to learn from this? You could ask the question, what about the third who refused to obey, that stopped? What do we know about them? Well, it turns out we couldn't find out anything. There was no correlation about their socioeconomic condition, their religious background, their educational level. There was none. What we did find out, and this is very, very important, was that they had a different internal process. And let me explain this to you. Professor Milgram observed there are two states that we act from. One is the autonomous state. This is when we're making choices and we hold ourselves accountable for those choices. This is a healthy adult state. He named the other state the agentic state. What does that mean? It means when we feel we're operating as an agent of an authority figure. And at that point, we let ourselves off the hook. We say, we're not responsible. The person giving the order is responsible. Do you see? And that's the problematic state. If we allow ourselves to go into that state, that's when bad things happen. Okay? Now, in other words, we can never say, I was just following orders. Okay? even in the military, the U.S. military code, I don't know what it's like here, says that not only do you not have to follow an illegal order, you must not. And soldiers have been tried and convicted for following an order because the order itself was illegal. And they were trying to excuse their behavior based on that. Not acceptable, you see. So you can't say I was just following orders. So, but there's a little more to learn here. Why did those people who stopped obeying, what was going on that they were able to find those internal resources to stop obeying? And if you can track with this next slide, you'll have the secret here. Okay, this is kind of the secret. He found that there were 4 phases in relation to the authority. The first phase was cooperating. Okay, I signed up for this experiment. You know, they're giving me 50 rand to do the experiment, and I'm going to just, you know, do what I'm told to do. Let's see if the experiment teaches us anything about learning. Once the victim started to express discomfort, they went into what he observed was the strained phase. Gee, I'm giving these commands, I'm giving these shocks, and this person is saying it's hurting, he's in pain. Is this right? Who should I follow? The supposed authority figure, or, you know, my own ears and eyes? But they didn't stop then. They just experienced strain. The third phase was that the strain got so great that now they had to do something about it. They couldn't stand the strain anymore between this person screaming, saying, "Stop, I've got a heart condition, I want out, I refuse to go on," and the authority figure saying, "You must go on, you must go on. This is what the experiment requires." You see? Matt, you feel the strain there? You feel the tension? And here's what happened. This is the difference between those who continued obeying and those who didn't. There are 2 ways to resolve the strain. The first way is to reduce your divergence with the authority figure. You just say, I'm going to stop fighting this. They're the authority figure. I'm just going to do what they say. The strain melts away, but the wrong obedience continues, you see. The other option is to amplify the diversion. Say, I don't care if you're the authority figure. I've got my own conscience. I have my own values. I'm not going to do it. And that resolves the strain. But now, the ethical thing is done, and you no longer continue doing harm. That's what we have to somehow teach both our professionals and, frankly, our children as well. To understand that just resolving the strain isn't enough. It's how you resolve it. And do you resolve it in an ethical way? All right, now, Professor Milgram was just looking at the social dynamics of how people behave in groups. He had some very interesting observations in my book. I explore those. We don't have time tonight to do that. But what he didn't do, he was not in the business of training people. Now, those of you who work in corporate, you know, in the corporate world, or the military, or police, or firefighting, or education, we know that training makes a difference between how people do their jobs, okay? And so, in a couple of industries, we've really learned how to train people to not follow wrong orders. The first is the aviation industry. Now, in the 1970s, there was a series of fatal airline crashes where jumbo jets crashed and everybody aboard died, or maybe just a few people lived. And it got so bad that the flying public, you know, was getting, is it really safe to fly? So they had to do something about it. And what they found when they investigated was that the main error was a human error. And this is what the human error was. Either the crew member saw something and thought, well, you know, it's pretty obvious what's happening. The pilot must see it as well. So they didn't say anything. Or they tried to warn the captain. But the captain was the captain. And they were, you know, junior to the captain. So they said it very meekly. And if the captain, you know, rebuffed them, they didn't say it again. And if you look at the black box transcripts, where the maybe co-pilot is weakly saying, you know, I think we don't have enough airspeed or something like that, and a minute and 21 seconds later, everybody dies. You know, so it's just, you know, really painful reading this. So what they did was they instituted something called Crude resource management training, where they trained the cockpit crew, the cabin crew, they put them in simulations. They would have something unexpected happen. They would have the captain give the wrong order, and they trained the crew to speak up assertively enough so that the captain then corrected what was happening, okay? And as a result, airline safety improved dramatically, civilian and military, and it's remained so to this day. Okay, so that's one real-world example of how you can train people to do a better job of intelligent disobedience. What's happening now is hospitals are now adopting this. They've gone to the aviation industry because, I don't know about this country, but in the US we have far too many errors, medical errors, and there's estimates of maybe 100,000 people a year dying because of medical errors in hospitals. And what they found again was that the surgeon, who was sort of like the captain of the airplane, nobody would speak up to correct him. So they now have instituted a checklist where before an operation starts, before surgery starts, every single member of the surgery team, from the lowest person, has to verbally say, yes, it's okay to start. They have a checklist. Do we have the right person? Do we have the right limb? Do we have the right part? Do we have the right blood, etc., etc. And everyone, they can't just shake their head. They have to say, yes, it's okay to start. In other words, they have to be accountable, regardless of who else has said it. And then when they finish the surgery, the surgeon has to say, does everybody agree we're ready to end the surgery? And if the lowest person in the room says, I counted 13 sponges in and we've only taken 12 out, so I can't agree to ending, the surgeon must look for the 13th sponge, you see. So what we're doing is we're training people to not just be passive in the face of authority, but to learn how to be accountable and how teams can be accountable. How does this apply in business school? We're in a business school here. So unfortunately, Columbia University, one of the premier business schools in the US, survey of 1,000 graduates, more than 40% had said that they had been rewarded for taking an action that they considered to be ethically troubling. 40%. In the business world, there's just so many pressures that people are often pushed to the line. In contrast, only 31% felt that they were penalized when they tried to do the right thing and say, no, that's not right. And only 20% were rewarded. So this isn't, an action for weaklings. This requires courage, requires integrity. You have to know that you're not always going to, your dissent is not always going to be warmly accepted, but you've got to be able to live with yourself, you see. And ultimately, your professional reputation depends on your track record. So, here's a CEO of the 10th largest holding bank in the US. And he had this to say, that financial services, banking, is based on a foundation of trust. And the pressure for performance can create conditions in which choices are made that compromises trust. At those junctures, intelligent disobedience is the core competency for doing the right thing. The core competency. So we have to ask, how do we develop that? And you say, but I'll get fired if I say no. If I say no to the boss, I'll get fired. This woman was an accountant at a firm called WorldCom. WorldCom was a very high-flying telecommunications firm in the States. Its share prices were just going through the roof. It had such great performance, except that it didn't really. And this woman's managers came to her and said, this month we didn't really make our numbers that Wall Street thought we were going to make. could you just make a little adjustment this month? You know, we don't want to scare our investors. Well, she went home, she talked to her husband, she wrote a letter of resignation because she knew it was wrong, and then she ripped up the letter of resignation, went back and did what her manager said. They said, it's just for this month. Next month came along, and they said, you know, just one more month. One more month. Can you adjust the numbers one more month? Well, now she was down the slippery slope, you see. By the time the 4th or 5th month came along, she had misrepresented the company's earnings by $1 billion, okay? And the internal auditor confronted her with it. She broke down and confessed. She knew it was wrong. And she went to jail. The CEO went to jail, the COO went to jail, but she went to jail as well because she couldn't just say I was following orders, you see. And the judge at the trial said, you know, it's possible if she had refused to do what was asked to do, it's possible the conspiracy might have been nipped in the bud, avoided. It probably wouldn't have, but it might have. And she, at least, wouldn't have gone to jail, you see. So these are very real-world pressures that can happen here. And you can't just say, well, I told him it was wrong. No, it's not what you say, it's what you do. Very high standard here of accountability, okay? So, let's see what we can learn from the guide dog, right? The dog's man's best friend. Do you have that expression in this country? No? Dog's a man's best friend. Well, I'm saying that intelligent disobedience is the leader's best friend, even though they don't know it, right? And what would the guide dog do? Well, here's some of the things the guide dog would do. The dog would observe the risk. Whoa, there's a car coming around the corner. Instead of obeying, it would sort of pause and assess the situation. And then it would resist obeying. And if the command was repeated, forward, it would still resist. But that's not enough. Resistance isn't enough. So it's interesting. The dog is not allowed to bark. Because if they bark, it's confusing to the blind person and it's scary to the people around them. So the dog has to just use its physical presence to not obey. Humans, of course, we can bark, right? You've got a voice. We can say, no, watch out, car's coming. So partly we have to learn how to use our voice in order to intelligently disobey. There's another thing we can learn from guide dogs. Here's an example. I went to the oldest guide dog training school in the United States, and they take the dogs to the train platform, and you know the train is coming in, and the person who's blind says forward, and if the train's here and the door's here, no problem. But let's say that today, for some reason, the train stopped a little short. The blind person didn't realize it, and says go forward, and starts to walk forward. Instead of just disobeying, the guide dog is trained to pull them in the other direction. It's called a counter pull. Well, there might be times when you have to counter pull a boss that you're working for. You see, save them from falling onto the track. The dog also has to be able to find safe alternatives. In other words, let's say they walk to the train station every morning, but this morning there's been a storm, there's branches down, there's wires came down, and it would be dangerous to take the usual path. Well, it's not enough for the dog to just disobey and lead the person there, right? It has to problem solve and figure out how to safely get the team to where they're going. The dog can go under things and jump over things the human can't, you see? So it really intelligently has to figure out a safe alternative. And then, once it's executed that, it can then return the lead to the human. And in a sense, it's taken over the lead. Okay, so I believe that in all of our teams, you know, people in businesses and other in government, people go off for a day or two to do team building, to do strategy. I believe you could just spend an hour saying, let's practice what we would do if we get a wrong order. You see, how will we deal with this intelligent disobedience? And just a little bit of that would make it then much easier for each person to actually do it, because it's become an accepted protocol. But the problem is, with the human dog team, the human usually listens. They often don't listen the first time or second time, and they go forward anyway when the dog says not to. They hit their head on a low branch, and they learn, I better listen to the dog. Humans aren't that. Our leaders aren't always that smart, so they don't always listen. So what are our options? First, we can clarify the order. Sir, I heard you say that you want me to do this and this and that. Is that right? Maybe I misheard. Maybe I did. Well, maybe that's enough to get them to say, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. Let me rephrase that. Or I can query the order. I can say, I don't think that's the right order. I would like to suggest we do this instead, verbally. Okay? Maybe the leader will respond to that. If they don't, we can say, well, sir, I'm going to need that in writing, please. If it's a really bad order, most leaders will not put it in writing, you see. And so that tends to just change the dynamics enough to avoid the worst outcomes. You can also appeal to a higher level. We know that can cause some problems with your direct supervisor, but if you do it in a way that doesn't make your direct supervisor look bad, it doesn't always worsen the relationship, because your supervisor might also know it's a bad order. Just he or she wasn't courageous enough to say it, and they actually thank you for having said it to their boss, you see. Now this is the toughest, and you can say really raise the potential of resigning, but yes, again, it's better than going to jail. That, if you insist on doing that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to step down. And if you're good at what you do, and you have a good reputation and track record, that will get the leader to rethink things. Really? You feel this is so wrong that you would step down? Yes. I better rethink this then. And we have very real-world examples of this happening. The last option, and the one we want to do the least, is to report to an oversight group. That's kind of whistleblowing, isn't it? And whistleblowers don't tend to fare very well. So it's really the last resort. What we're trying to do is create teams that are self-correcting. You don't have to go outside the organization to correct what's happening. Okay, now these are all kind of very, I don't want to leave you on a down note. These are all the bad things that can happen. So let's try to end on a happier note, where you actually avoided the danger and you return the lead to the human being. I'll end with one very quick story before I take questions. It was 9/11. There's a story of intelligent disobedience where 2,800 lives were saved. The security officer for Stanley Morgan, who had 2,800 employees in the second tower, he realized that the towers were very vulnerable, and he tried to get the management of the company to move the company, and they wouldn't do it. So what he did do was get them to agree to every single month to have a safety drill, where every month all 2,800 people evacuated the building, which is a very high expense when you have very highly paid people. But he insisted on that, and he got cooperation. When the planes hit the first tower on 9/11, an order came over the loudspeaker for everybody to stay in place. Don't leave your desks. He knew immediately that was the wrong order, and he disobeyed it. He activated the drill, got all 2,800 people out of the building safely, except for 2 were unaccounted for. So he went back in to find those 2, and the building collapsed, and he and those 2 perished. So, it was an act of great self-service. But he saved 2,800 lives by his planning for what to do in a situation like that, and his understanding there is a moment when obedience is not only not right, it's downright dangerous. So hopefully we will all, get better at how do we respond in a situation where the choice is up to us. What do we do?